Welcome to another session in our class on the book of Daniel. This lesson was presented on Thursday evening, the 4th of February 2021, for the British Bible School in a Zoom class as the UK continues in lockdown. This is the outline that we're using for our study, and this week we will be in chapter 7. As you notice, we are not going straight through the book. We're attempting to study the book in a chronological way to see how that fits together. So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at Daniel's vision of the four beasts. The images, by the way, that I'm using in this are from a commentary by Uriah Smith entitled Daniel and the Revelation, published in 1897. And so they should be well out of copyright. With chapter 7 of Daniel, we begin what is known as the Apocalyptic section of the book. Apocalyptic literature was a familiar type of literature in the time leading up to the first century, but much less so today. These writings usually revealed something about world powers or great historical events. They usually contained numbers and animals. They usually were written during times of persecution and turmoil. They usually presented pictures which are, in essence, painted using words to produce some sort of a reaction. Now, we may not understand everything that's in a vision. When studying Daniel, sometimes those teaching it skip the last 6 chapters. They are difficult to understand, and we may be thinking, why bother? But I think we need to understand and study these chapters if we're going to make sense of some of the New Testament writings, in particular what Jesus said in Matthew 4, as well as the book of Revelation, which draws heavily on the visions of Daniel. This is where we are in our timeline. This particular chapter is going to be taking place a bit later on past chapter 4, although it's going to be before chapter 5. Chapter 7 and chapter 8 deal with the visions that Daniel had during the reign of King Belshazzar. So keep in mind that at this stage, the Babylon has not yet fallen to the Medes and Persians. It's still under Babylon. It's still the kingdom of Babylon. The vision of this chapter was in the first year of Belshazzar's reign, and that most scholars would place at 553 BC. Some, those suggest maybe it was 547 BC, so within about 5 or 6 years of that. Whichever one, it's roughly in that same time frame. So that tells us very much that this chapter fits between chapters 4 and 5 as the chronology goes, because chapter 5, when we get to that, takes place in the last year of Belshazzar's reign. So we're not quite that far yet. Daniel, of course, is quite a bit older now. If he was in his teens in chapter 1, then we're looking at probably he's up to his 60s or 70s in chapter 7. Some suggest as much as 70 to 75 years old. Both chapter 7 and chapter 8 has the same formula, which is what we're going to use in our class. Daniel first relates the vision that he saw. Then we have an interpretation of that vision. And we'll be adding bits more to it that we know from world history as well. Homer Haley had this to say about how these dreams are put together. He said, before an exposition is made of each dream and its visions, it might be helpful to make a brief summary of Daniel's dreams, showing the progressive development of these in revealing the future of the world kingdoms and the kingdom of God. Modern movies and video cassettes present an illustration of Daniel's method. Each series of visions is an episode of the total picture. And I think that's a good way to look at the vision chapters. Each being an episode of the whole, putting them all together, you get the complete picture. I've very much enjoyed and still enjoy the Marvel Avengers films. Waited each year for the new ones to come out, and my wife and I would go to the cinema. We have fortunate to have a 3D cinema here in Glasgow, and we were able to go and watch those, and we always looked forward to it. But one thing you discovered after enjoying the initial film was that each of these was contributing something to the overall story. And by putting them all together, we got a view of the big picture, did we not? Culminating, of course, in that great battle in the last couple of films. That's what we're going to see in Daniel as well. Putting these visions together, coupling it with the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in Daniel 2, I think we're going to get a good view of what was going to happen in the world. Now, Daniel has this dream, this vision, in chapter 7, while in bed. Of course, he would later on have written it down. Wiersbe gives us a little bit of a framework here. He said, King Nabonidus was monarch over the empire, but he made his son Belshazzar ruler over Babylon, and the first year of his reign was probably 553. This means that the events described in chapters 7 and 8 preceded those described in chapters 5 and 6, and Daniel was nearly 70 years old at the time these events occurred. That's just saying what I said earlier, but I wanted to include that because it gives us a little bit of an idea of where Belshazzar comes in. The king is Nabonidus. We know that from history. Belshazzar, though, we also know from history. We'll look at that in more detail when we get to chapter 5 in a couple of more weeks. But it would seem that Nabonidus has made Belshazzar the ruler over Babylon. And so that's why we have him in his first year of reign. In this vision that he sees 4 winds of heaven stirring up a great sea. Now, wind tends to, in apocalyptic literature, refer to upheaval. In this scene, the 4 winds of heaven, as Homer Haley puts it, in this scene, the 4 winds of heaven symbolize the strong forces which produce upheavals in society, out of which develop nations or various forms of government within nations. So this is what this seems to be referring to. The sea tends to refer to nations, and possibly some suggest restless nations. That's a common figure in apocalyptic language. As Daniel was in Babylon, this most likely does not refer to any specific sea, although some of the scholars suggest maybe he's thinking about the Mediterranean, remembering that from his childhood. And that's a possibility. Although Homer Haley comments that the Great Sea was not the Mediterranean Sea, but the sea of society or humanity. And he cites places where that is mentioned in that way. Out of the winds of upheaval, whether they be political, ethnic, social, or economic, various nations and forms of government develop. So I think he's absolutely correct here. So the wind being upheaval, the sea being the great sea of humanity, the wind breaking on the sea would seem to be talking about an upheaval in society. Now, numbers also have meanings in apocalyptic literature. The number 4 is the number of totality. So what we may be seeing here is that 4 winds indicating total upheaval. And that may be the idea. And we have 4 also in the 4 beasts that came out of the sea, and all the beasts being different. I do believe these are 4 beasts, but it seems to be talking about possibly even the totality of what was happening in world history, something like that. Homer Haley commented that from the turbulent sea of society, Daniel beheld 4 great beasts emerge, diverse one from another. As the people who make up the various nations differ in characteristics, so the nations comprised of these individuals are diverse one from another. Each had characteristics peculiar to itself. Each of these kingdoms or empires would be used to serve Jehovah's purpose according to its diverse characteristics. So the first of these beasts that he sees is a lion with eagle's wings. That's obviously not something that's literal, because we don't have those things. We've never found any animals like that and don't have them today for definite. But it is a symbol. As Daniel watched, though, the wings were plucked off, and this lion was lifted up and made to stand like a human, and the mind of a human was given to it. Aramaic, by the way, literally there is that the heart of a man was given to it. Of course, the heart indicating the intellect, so the mind goes well as it has there in the Net Bible. Followed very quickly, we'll comment on what this is when we get down to the interpretation, but followed very quickly by another image. This one is a bear, and it's like a bear that's raised up on one side. It has in its mouth 3 ribs, and it's told to devour much flesh. And this one was followed by another beast, and this beast was like a leopard with 4 wings on its back, or the Aramaic word there could be translated side, so back or side. Either one works there. It also has 4 heads, and it was given ruling authority. And then we have the 4th beast. The 4th beast was a terrifying and very strong beast. It had iron teeth, and it devoured, it broke in pieces, and it stamped on what was left. The Aramaic word for teeth, by the way, is a dual word rather than a plural word. So the possibility is that it is referring to 2 rows of teeth, which is very much what the Net Bible has there. The 4th beast, though, was different than the others because it has 10 horns. And while Daniel was considering 10 horns, and I think if we saw something like that, we would probably be thinking about it as well, another little horn came up and uprooted 3 of the other ones. This new little horn had the eyes of a man and a mouth which spoke great things, which spoke arrogant things. These beasts, as we're going to see in the interpretation, are kingdoms, but we'll get to that when we get down to the interpretation. There's then another phase of the vision, or possibly it's another vision. Homer Haley in his commentary takes the idea that it's another vision. To me, it sort of seems it's just another act in this vision. And the next one is, while he's watching, the vision changes. Daniel saw thrones being set up, and the Ancient of Days takes a seat. Now that phrase, Ancient of Days, could easily be translated the Ancient One. I think that's probably more literal. The Net Bible explained that it goes with Ancient of Days because this is a familiar phrase to most readers of Daniel. So we'll use Ancient of Days as well. His clothing, white as snow. His hair is like lamb's wool, and that could be translated like pure wool. His throne is fiery flames. And there's wheels as well. And the wheels were burning fire. This seems to be very similar to Ezekiel's vision of God's war chariot, God on the throne in Ezekiel, but in a war chariot with the wheels. And this is very, very similar to that. Homer Haley tries to make some symbolic application here, and he may be right in what he suggests. He says the fire was symbolic of the finality of the judgment. The ones judged would never again exist. And the wheels symbolize the universality of God the judge. He could be everywhere. His judgments were not limited to Zion, Jerusalem. And the text tells us that a stream of fire came out from before him. If you put in your mind's picture an active volcano with the fire and then the stream of flowing lava that comes down and destroys everything in its path. That's very similar to what Daniel is seeing here. And we have other scriptures from the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures, that describe God in this way, such as Psalm 97. The Lord reigns, let the earth be happy, let the many coastlands rejoice. Dark clouds surround him. Equity and justice are the foundation of his throne. Fire goes before him. On every side it burns up his enemies. His lightning bolts light up the world. The earth sees and trembles. Again, a very similar type of picture to what Daniel is seeing. Daniel goes on that 1,000 thousands served him. 1,000 thousands, by the way, is 1,000,000. Net Bible translation has many thousands served him. And that may be the idea there. And then goes on to say 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. That, by the way, would be 100 million. Net Bible has many 10,000s. I think the idea of these numbers is not a precise number. It's just describing an innumerable crowd of people. The court is sitting in judgment, and the books were opened. Again, going to Homer Haley, he tells us that the books symbolized the charges brought against the ones being judged and their penalties executed. Also, the books included God's moral law, the violation of which had condemned the nations in the world judgment revealed by Isaiah in chapter 24. Also, they contained the prophecies addressed by Jehovah to the heathen nations via the prophets sent to Israel. Daniel then heard, as he keeps on watching, the sound of great words that the horn was speaking, arrogant words. As Daniel watched, though, the beast, that last beast, is killed, its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. And the rest of the beasts lost their ruling authority as well, but they retained their lives for a time and a season. It indicates a prolonging of life was granted to them. I think that all that fits in well with what we see in Revelation. The beast there has characteristics of all of the three previous kingdoms. We'll see that later on as we get to the explanation of this. Homer Haley commented that the beast being burned with fire symbolized the completeness of its destruction. It would never exist again. He then, as he continues watching, saw one like a son of man, like a human, but more than a man. He came with the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. One thing that we know from Old Testament scripture is that it's deity that comes on clouds. So we get a little bit of a hint as to what's going on here. Again, we'll examine that a little bit later on. To him was given ruling authority, your translation may have dominion, honor or glory, and sovereignty or a kingdom. All peoples, nations, and languages were serving or worshiping him. His ruling authority would be everlasting. It would not pass away, and his kingdom would never be destroyed. Now, it does seem obvious to me that the Son of Man here is the Messiah, and the Ancient of Days would be God the Father. And I think it is of significance that Jesus applied this vision to himself. Do you remember when he was before Caiaphas? We often call it the trial before Caiaphas, but it wasn't really a trial. It was really more of a kangaroo court. As he's there before Caiaphas. And this is what he said, recorded by Matthew. You have said it yourself, but I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. That first part that's underscored there is from Psalm 110, verse 1, and that last part is where we are at here, Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. Of course, Jesus used that phrase, Son of Man, probably most often to describe himself. Now, that's not the only view of all this, but I think that's the one that is accurate. That we're seeing here the Messiah, and I think because Jesus applies this to himself, we can see that this is what it is supposed to be. Homer Haley wrote that Daniel does not say that he saw God, but that God was represented by the very aged and honorable one, arrayed in a snow-white robe whose hair was like pure wool. Each of these, the white robe and hair, probably symbolized absolute purity, as well as age that extended back to the beginning of nations and empires, which would be judged. If you remember from Revelation, white there symbolizes purity. White is God's color in the book of Revelation, if white is a color for that matter. If you'd like to learn more about Revelation, I'd refer you to our recorded lessons that are on this YouTube channel on Revelation, which I taught last year. But the basic message in this vision seems to be, no matter how bad it looked, God's promises would hold. Yahweh was the one in control. It seems to me to be obvious that this dream is parallel to Nebuchadnezzar's vision back in chapter 2. 4 kingdoms to be supplanted by God's eternal kingdom. Where Warren Wiersbe wrote, the angel told Daniel that the 4 beasts represented 4 kingdoms, the same sequence of empires that Nebuchadnezzar had seen in his dream back in chapter 2. However, the king saw a great and impressive image made of valuable metals, while Daniel saw dangerous beasts that ruthlessly devoured peoples and nations. To human eyes, the nations of the world are like Nebuchadnezzar's great image, impressive and important. But from God's viewpoint, the nations are only ferocious beasts that attack and seek to devour one another. I thought that was a good point that Wiersbe made in his commentary. But this vision that Daniel has, it bothered him. It troubled him. Homer Haley, though, commented also on that. He said it's doubtful that the terrible appearance of the beasts caused this reaction, but the realization of what lay ahead for his people. There was the terrible period of the Babylonian captivity, which was nearing its end, but according to the vision, there were 3 world kingdoms yet to be endured by God's people. That's a good point, isn't it? He is bothered by it, but it doesn't seem to be necessarily what he saw, but what happened. In his vision, he approached one of those who were standing there. So we see that Daniel, even though it's a vision, he's participating in the vision as well. And he asked this person, this being, what this vision was about. He was told that the 4 beasts are 4 kingdoms, possibly, or 4 kings, possibly 4 kingdoms, or possibly it's referring to the first ruler in each kingdom, because the first ruler in each kingdom was very significant in world history. Again, I think that seems to be parallel to the vision of chapter 2. John Lennox had this to say: these visions concern a zoo of strange and frightening animals. The first of them, in chapter 7, is of 4 wild beasts depicting 4 empires. As such, it forms a striking parallel to the 4-part statue seen in Nebuchadnezzar's vision in chapter 2. Both visions concentrate in particular on the 4th empire and its eventual destruction. It is surely not unreasonable, therefore, to take it that these visions represent 2 distinct ways of looking at the same 4 empires. And so this is a view that's commonly held amongst our scholars. So the lion would be equivalent to the head of gold. And that we know from the vision is Babylon. Lion, of course, the king of the beasts. The eagle, of course, is the most majestic of birds. But I think both are emphasizing the same thing as the head of gold. This is Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, by the way, is referred to elsewhere in the prophets as a lion. Jeremiah uses that in chapter 4 and chapter 50. Habakkuk and Ezekiel both refer to Nebuchadnezzar as an eagle. Now, by the time Belshazzar has his vision, Nebuchadnezzar is long gone. But by extension, this is applying to the whole of the kingdom of Babylon. That eagle's wings are there might suggest the speed with which Nebuchadnezzar expanded the Babylonian Empire. That the wings were pulled off and the lion was made to stand like a human and given a mind, literally a heart of a person, indicates that something changed. I like Homer Haley's idea of this. He says, this seems to indicate that when the nations were conquered by the power of God through the Babylonian king, his special power from God ceased. His rule of the empire, of which very little was known following the conquest, was like other kings who ruled their subjects, with ordinary human wisdom. I think that's a good, intriguing idea as to what all this means. The plucking of the wings was God's withdrawing his backing of Babylon. We do know from Isaiah, or from Jeremiah in particular, that it was God that was using Nebuchadnezzar. But another possibility that some scholars come up with is that this has to do with Nebuchadnezzar's insanity, which we studied about in the previous lesson. The Net Bible Study Note says, the identity of the first animal, derived from verse 17 and the parallels in chapter 2, is Babylon. The reference to the plucking of its wings is probably a reference to the time of Nebuchadnezzar's insanity. The latter part of verse 4 then describes the restoration of Nebuchadnezzar. And that very well could be, although I tend to think that it is talking there about God withdrawing his backing of Babylon. But take whichever one you like. We then come to the bear. The bear is equivalent to the chest of silver, which we know from our previous study is the Medo-Persian Empire. At the time, the largest species of bear was thought to live in the mountains of Media. That this bear has one side higher than the other could refer to the Persians becoming the more dominant of the two kingdoms. Homer Haley agrees with that idea in his commentary. And we'll see similar things when we get to chapter 8, the visions there. We're not told what the ribs are. Some have suggested perhaps it's just greed. Others have suggested that it represents the conquest by Medo-Persia of possibly three great kingdoms, Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. Homer Haley, though, has another idea based upon the symbolism of the number 3. He wrote, but since the empire included so many former kingdoms and provinces, and it occurs in a figurative and symbolic context, this seems unlikely, referring to those 3 kingdoms we mentioned earlier. If 3 is the divine number, not simply the Trinity, then could not the 3 present the total provinces allotted by divine providence to Cyrus and the empire, the totality of what he was going to conquer? About 100 years before his birth, God named Cyrus and promised that he would hold his hand, and through him he would subdue nations, and for him he would open gates. The Medo-Persians arose and devoured much flesh, the complete conquest of the divine allotment. And again, I think Homer Haley has a good idea there, that this may simply be referring to God's backing of Cyrus and his conquest, because we know that God was behind it. Isaiah includes that. We then have the next section, which is the torso of bronze, the four-headed leopard. That would be the same. This seems to be referring to Greece. 4 wings, some have suggested, may represent speed, And under Alexander the Great, we know that Greece rapidly conquered the world. The four heads would seem to be talking about the empire being divided into four kingdoms after Alexander's death. We're going to see more about that in chapter 8. Then we have the terrifying beast with iron teeth. And that would seem to be the same as the legs of iron and feet of iron and clay that we saw back in the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in Daniel chapter 2, and referring to the Roman Empire. Notice that there was no animal with which to compare this kingdom. It's different from all the other animals before it, but all four had some things in common. But this one is a terrifying one. Interesting that all four of these, the common things that they had were they sought to conquer and control and rule the world by military force. These were all four idolatrous nations. They worshipped a plethora, a large number of gods. And they strongly opposed Yahweh and his kingdom. The Net Bible Study Notes explained, the fourth animal differs from the others in that it is nondescript. Apparently it was so fearsome that Daniel could find nothing with which to compare it. Attempts to identify this animal as an elephant or other known creature are conjectural. And I've not found any commentators that did refer to it as an elephant, but they've got to depict it somewhat. And some of the commentaries, there's drawings of these, and some of them go with a dinosaur-type creature. And I can see why they would do that. The ones we're using, of course, it just goes with a horrific animal-type creature. So it's an interesting one. The text goes on to talk about the holy ones of the Most High. As the Net Bible puts it, the English Standard Version has the saints of the Most High, and the New International Version has the holy people. These would receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. The Bible Study Notes says that the expression holy ones could either be a reference to angels, to human beings devoted to God, or to both. The context, they suggest, is an earthly kingdom the holy ones would possess, and man was appointed to rule the earth. The holy ones are defeated and harassed by an earthly ruler in chapter 7, verses 21-25, and human rulers cannot defeat and harass angels. So the holy ones are almost certainly human beings devoted to God. I think their conclusion is correct, although this kingdom they're going to possess does not seem to be an earthly kingdom. It seems to be the same as that spiritual kingdom we saw back in Daniel chapter 2. Daniel is very curious about this fourth beast, this very terrifying one with teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and about the 10 horns, and then that little one that came up and had a mouth that spoke arrogant things. In fact, as Daniel watched, this little horn made war with the holy ones, with the saints, and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the holy ones of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. Now these horns, we're told, are kings. Now Homer Haley in his commentary emphasized that the number should be viewed symbolically. But as the text says, the 10 horns are 10 kings. To me, the most logical explanation is that they are indeed 10 kings. And if this kingdom is representing Rome, and I believe that is, everything points towards that, then the 10 kings would seem to be these kings, starting with Julius, followed by Augustus and Tiberius, and then Caligula, Claudius, sixth one being Nero, then we have the three, Galba and Otho and Vitellius, who were followed by Vespasian, and then finally the 11th one being Titus. Now in Revelation, John speaks only of 8 rather than 11. As we have 10 plus the 1 here, John only talks about 8. The difference seems to be that he left out these 3 here. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. They were only in power very briefly after Nero's death. Nero commits suicide in 68. Galba ascends the throne in the beginning of 69. And by the end of 69, all three of these had either been assassinated or committed suicide to keep from being assassinated. And Vespasian is the one then who's the next emperor. And I think that's the comparison between Daniel 7 and what we find in the book of Revelation. We are told that this fourth kingdom would be different from all the kingdoms. It does have horns, which is different, and it's also going to trample on the whole earth and break it to pieces, which is not said about the others. I was thinking about that phrase, about Rome being different than the others, and it was interesting when you think about even how they conquered. Now, this may not be what it's talking about, but this is some thoughts that I had. They conquered differently, didn't they? Babylon relied on displacing people through exile. That's how they controlled the world. Medo-Persia did it differently. If you remember, well, as we will see, they restored people to their homeland. Greece, though, conquered, didn't exile, didn't really displace, but they did give culture. And then Rome. Rome comes along and tries to assimilate all the people of the world they conquered into their empire as their people, as Romans. And they intermarried with them. If you think in Star Trek terms, that would be very much the Borg. Assimilation and resistance was indeed futile. Now, I don't know if that's what's meant here, but those are some thoughts. I think we can see that Rome was different in what it did. We are told that those 10 horns are 10 kings. And then the 11th horn was another king, a different one, who would put down 3 kings, and he would speak against the Most High, and he would wear out the holy ones. He would wear out the saints. By the way, wearing out, which we have here in the Net Bible, seems to be a literal translation of the Aramaic. New King James Version has that he would persecute them. In the International Version, that he would oppress them. He would change the times in the law, and they would be given into his hand for time, times, and half a time. And that phrase, by the way, is used many times in the book of Revelation, isn't it? And as when we studied Revelation, and you can refer back to those lessons, believe that refers to Jerusalem's destruction. And a lot of, in fact, the majority of the commentaries I've been reading on Daniel will tell you that that refers to Jerusalem's destruction. In Revelation, it uses that image of 1,260 days as well, and 42 months, which is 3.5 years, which corresponds to the time that Jerusalem was under siege and finally fell to the Roman army under Titus, who I believe is the 11th horn that's listed there. That Bible study note says, although the word times is vocalized in the Masoretic text as a plural, it should be probably regarded as a dual. The Masoretes may have been influenced here by the fact that in late Aramaic and Syriac, the dual form falls out of use. The meaning would thus be 3.5 times. So it's not an indefinite times. It seems to be referring to 2. So time 1, 2's 2.5, and half being, of course, half. Add them together, 3.5. Of course, 3.5 times 3.5 is also the half of 7. So if you're thinking about numerology, 7 is the number of perfection, of completeness. 3.5 would be the opposite of that. And I think that really fits Titus well, being the 11th, the arrogant horn. He's the one who was in charge of Jerusalem's destruction. He's the one who destroyed the keeping of the law of Moses. He's the one that wore out the saints in Jerusalem, whether you're thinking about Jews or Christians, although we know that the Christians fled the city due to Jesus' warning in Matthew chapter 24. Emmanuel Doherty, in his commentary on the book of Daniel, wrote this: The question may be asked, who were these saints Titus wore out? Titus, as commander of the Roman armies, led the siege against Jerusalem and the Jews, destroying the temple and the holy city, thus wearing out the saints who were Jews from Daniel's Old Testament perspective, nearly 600 years previous to the events of AD 70. When we hear the word saint, we usually automatically assume that it's referring to Christians. The holy ones are Christians. But there were no Christians in the time of Daniel. It's way too early for that. But Israelites and Jews were also referred to as saints or holy ones. We find that in 1 Samuel, in the book of Psalms, and in Matthew. In Matthew, saints were resurrected at Jesus' death. Those couldn't be Christians, as there were not any yet. They would have to be Jews as well. You're probably familiar that the word saint in Greek literally refers to the set-apart ones, the set-apart people. Probably this term, as it's used, simply refers to those who are God's people. Just no matter which covenant they're serving under at the time. So in the Old Testament scriptures, it would refer to the Israelites and the Jews, and primarily in New Testament scripture, it would refer to Christians, although, as we see in Matthew, it also refers to Jews there. It's Titus who made war on the Jews, who at the time of Daniel's writing were God's people. And it would also include Jews who became Christians. They're the ones who triumph, aren't they? They're the ones who are given the kingdom. Same nationality, but a different allegiance because they've accepted Jesus as the Messiah. God's court would convene. That's telling us that this king, this 11th king, wouldn't be all-powerful because God's court is going to sit in judgment and his dominion would be taken away to be consumed and destroyed. So the image we have here is of a courtroom scene. And if you will, here's the scene that we see playing out before us. The saints come in. They're beaten. They're battered. But they're claiming the kingdom is theirs. The beast comes in, snorting and roaring. And he claims the kingdom as his. And then God rules in favor of the saints. The greatness of all the kingdoms would be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. They would have an everlasting kingdom that all others would serve and obey. And that's the end, by the way, of this vision and what little interpretation that Daniel was given. This would seem to be parallel with much of what we find in the book of Revelation, as I've been saying. One thing we can see from this is that the prophets received visions which they did not understand. Daniel doesn't understand it. In fact, even after the brief explanation he's given, he said, "As for me, Daniel, my thoughts troubled me greatly, and the color drained from my face. But I kept the matter to myself." He's upset. He's troubled by this vision. Homer Haley wrote that in spite of the explanation of the visions given by the attendant to Daniel, visions which troubled him, he concluded by saying, "My thoughts much troubled me," which probably manifested concern in the expression on his face. But he kept the matter in his heart to ponder in the days to come. Now, it's common if you read the commentaries to see many try to make this not applicable beyond Greece. And they usually have this Daniel being written during the time of the Maccabees, which is around the 160s BC. And therefore, the little horn they have as being Antiochus Epiphanes. As I mentioned in an earlier lesson, simple problem to me with that being written this late is that Daniel is found in the Septuagint. Septuagint, that Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, which was translated between 250 and 200 BC, which is 50 to 100 years before the date they're giving for this being written. It doesn't make much sense. But if you want to see that particular explanation of this being applied to Greece, and the Antiochus Epiphanes. I would refer you to the Word Biblical Commentary written by John Goldingay on Daniel, or F.W. Farrer's commentary on Daniel in the Expositor's Bible series. That latter can be found online because it's well out of copyright. But I do think that one thing we see here is a striking contrast between Daniel chapter 7 and the book of Revelation. Daniel 7 verse 24, the 10 horns are 10 kings. We see the same thing in Revelation 17 verse 12. This kingdom, this beast, speaks haughty words, particularly through that last horn. We find the same thing in Revelation, that the beast speaks blasphemies. We do find, though, that in both of them, we find being made war with the saints. In Daniel, it prevails. In Revelation, it's the Jews, and they conquer the Jews. But its authority is limited to, in Daniel, times and a half a time. In Revelation, it talks about 42 months. It talks about 1,260 days. It talks about 3.5 years. It talks about times and a half a time. All of them's there. The beast in Revelation combines the features of the first 3 beasts in Daniel's vision. It's like a leopard. It has feet like a bear. It has mouth like a lion. And we see all of those present in Daniel's vision in chapter 7. And by the way, those thoughts there are from John Lennox's commentary Against the Flow. What lessons can we learn from Daniel 7? I think the obvious lesson to me, it's the obvious lesson in every chapter in Daniel, is that God is indeed in control. As Warren Wiersbe put it, if there's one message that is emphasized in the book of Daniel, it's that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. God's in control. We have nothing to fear. A second thing I think we can see in this particular chapter, and we've seen this earlier as well, that God knows the future. He knows what's going to happen. Homer Haley writes, in Daniel, 3 night visions and the explanation of them by one of the throng before Jehovah, God provided for his people and the world a capsule history of the future of his kingdom and the 4 great world empires. The captives were on the threshold of emerging from a 70-year captivity of the first beast. But there would be 3 beasts to follow which would rule over his people and the remnant. This is letting his people know that this is not going to be over. There's more to come. But we also see in all of this that God's going to take care of his people. Again, Homer Haley wrote this. In time of national calamity, looked upon as judgment from God because of national sins, the Christian finds encouragement in the fact that it is a righteous judgment that is well deserved. The everlasting kingdom of Daniel 7:13-14 has been set up, and the saints of the Most High possess it. And the believer has been translated into it. It refers there to Colossians 1:13. This fact affords great comfort, hope, and power to hold fast under all trials and opposition. We are, as Christians, we are in God's kingdom today. Revelation chapter 1 emphasizes that as well. Not something that we're still looking to come. It is something that we are part of, that we possess as God's people. So God's going to take care, has taken care, and will continue to take care of his people. And the final lesson, we need to keep in mind that there is a day of judgment, a future day of judgment for all people. The judgment that's being spoken of here in Daniel 7 is the judgment of these empires. But there's also, we know from Jesus' teaching, a future day of judgment for all people. John Lennox wrote, the fact that there is to be a judgment is of paramount importance. And I emphasize this point since there are some who say that the less said about such things, the better. After all, they argue God is a God of love and talk about judgment is grim and medieval. They could not be more wrong, as a little thought will show. And he goes on in his commentary to list Psalm chapter 96, in particular verses 10-13. He goes on to say, far from future judgment being a dark and negative concept, especially based on Psalm 96, It's the exact opposite. It's a cause for joy. And the reason is obvious. Human beings long for justice, yet many of them never experience it in this life. What Daniel tells us is that this is not the end of the matter. Just because there are horrible things happening in the world, that's not the end of it. There's something else that's going to happen. And as we should often say, the best is yet to come, especially for God's people. We're living for a future better than anything that we could ever imagine. Thank you for taking time to listen to at least this explanation of Daniel chapter 7. I hope you have a good week and that you will come back and join us for the next installment when we will be looking at Daniel chapter 8. Have a good day.